going to start our course by reviewing an important technique that almost all creative nonfiction uses. It's called the double consciousness. This means that your work is doubly responsible for showing what happened and telling the reader what those events mean. In the chapter from To Show and To Tell that we're going to read for this week, Lopate mostly discusses the use of double consciousness in personal essay, but I find that good literary journalism, memoir, and cultural criticism use it too. There are lots of different metaphors for this double consciousness, which I've shown in this chart. You may have heard one or more of these metaphors before. Sometimes you'll hear CNF writers talk about a third category. In addition to showing and telling, there's also a component of thinking. The more formal literary terms for these are scene, exposition, and reflection. Scene refers to passages in a text where the reader can visualize what's happening because the writer uses imagery and detailed description of action and dialogue. Exposition means the writer is telling the big picture story by reporting what happened. And reflection is when the writer thinks about and makes meaning out of the experience. Here's an example of how this might look in an actual essay. Scene. I punched my sister in the nose. She howled, covering her face with both hands, and red blood oozed between her fingers. Exposition. I often hit my little sister when we were kids. Notice how this doesn't go into much detail. Some writers would argue that the exposition isn't always necessary, but it's certainly used more widely in nonfiction than in contemporary fiction. And finally, reflection. I now know I treated my sister so brutally because I was jealous of how our parents doted on her. I think Lopate would describe my reflection in this example as what he calls a, quote, pat sermon. He'd probably want to see some more interesting insight, but this gives you the basic idea of these three components of CNF. Another metaphor you'll sometimes hear, and this comes from CSU's own Stephanie Geschwind, is the story on the ground and the story in the sky. The story on the ground tells what happened, and the story in the sky explains what those events meant and why they matter. Another metaphor is that of the so-called double I. There's an I, E-Y-E, see what I did there? That observes the scene, and a capital I who reflects on it. Or we have the writer on the page, the I in the scene, and the writer at the desk, the I that's removed by some distance of time and reflecting on it all. And finally, this is the metaphor I tend to use, the narrator and the character. I've shown a younger character and an older narrator because the narrator is often, but not always, reflecting on something that happened earlier in his or her life. So here again, we can see the many different metaphors that are used to understand this concept, but they all have very similar meanings. I'm going to refer to scene, exposition, and reflection in this course, as well as the character and the narrator, and I'd encourage you to do the same for the sake of consistency on our discussions and workshops. When you read Lopate's chapter, you'll see that he's trying to understand why student writers are often resistant to the reflection component of CNF. And he comes up with a few hypotheses why student writers don't like to reflect. You don't have to agree with all of his ideas. I don't. But I do think he makes a strong case for the importance of retrospection, which I'll be looking for in your writing.